The moment Rowan Hale stepped down from the disabled jet, Evelyn Blackwood let her cane fall from her hand. She stared at the mechanic in the oil-stained jacket as though a dead man had just walked across the tarmac toward her. Chief Executive Sloane Blackwood froze beside her mother, watching the color drain from the older woman's face. Inside the cabin, a hidden navigation module had just sent a corrupted signal, the exact pattern that once destroyed a program the family swore had ended forever. Rowan tried to turn away, but it was already too late. Evelyn's whisper carried across the hangar like a verdict nobody had expected to hear again, and Sloane realized the failure that grounded her flight was never an accident at all. The private jet carrying Sloane Blackwood and her mother toward the meeting that would decide the future of the Vesper X program began reporting impossible position errors somewhere above the plains. The pilot diverted to Gray Haven Regional, a small airfield outside Blackwood Aeronautics maintenance network, because the nearest certified facility was too far to reach safely. Rowan Hale was the only technician on duty licensed for advanced avionics work, and he approached the aircraft with the same quiet focus he brought to every job, unimpressed by the woman stepping off the jet in a tailored coat. Within minutes, he traced the fault to something buried beneath the primary flight computer, a secondary signal feeding false data into the navigation system on a cycle so precise that it could not have been accidental. He pulled back a panel and found a small bridging device disguised as a routine diagnostic connector. Its casing scored where someone had scraped away a marking. Underneath the scratches, the faint outline of a 7-point constellation remained, and Rowan's hands went still the instant he recognized it. He covered the device before anyone else could see it, told the ground crew it was a simple sensor fault, and asked the passengers to wait outside while he finished the paperwork. He wanted the aircraft gone, the woman gone, and the entire afternoon forgotten before his daughter's babysitter expected him home. That plan ended the moment Evelyn Blackwood walked into the hangar and saw his face beneath the fluorescent lights. She dropped her cane, pressed her hand to her chest, and said a single word that no one at Greyhaven had ever spoken about him. Rowan told her flatly that he had mistaken him for someone else, his voice even despite the sudden tightness in his jaw. Evelyn answered with a line that only a handful of people alive still remembered, a phrase used to steady frightened pilots inside a program that no longer officially existed. Rowan did not move, and in his silence, Sloane understood that the woman trembling beside her had not imagined a stranger's resemblance. She had recognized a man everyone believed had died 12 years earlier. The security detail traveling with Sloane moved instinctively toward Rowan, unsure whether to treat Evelyn's outburst as the confused reaction of an older woman or a genuine threat to the aircraft they had just escaped. Sloane raised her hand to hold them back, more alarmed than alarmed, studying the mechanic's face for some trace of the recognition her mother so clearly felt. He did not resemble anyone from the corporate world Sloane usually moved through. No polished credentials, no tailored suit, only calloused hands and the quiet posture of a man who preferred machinery to people. Evelyn took an unsteady step forward, refusing help from the aide beside her, and asked Rowan directly whether he remembered a hangar in Nevada and a night when the desert wind nearly tore the doors off their hinges before a single test flight. Rowan's jaw tightened further, but he said nothing, and the silence itself told Evelyn everything the years apart had not managed to erase from her memory. Sloane ordered the hangar doors closed and asked Rowan to explain himself, her tone carrying the same authority that ran boardrooms twice the size of the small maintenance building around them. He refused, insisting he was nothing more than a civilian engineer who needed to get home before his neighbor put his daughter for bed for the night. A short phone call followed, Rowan's voice softening completely as he asked 9-year-old Maisie about her homework and promised to check on her model airplane before morning, a scene so ordinary that Evelyn's earlier accusation felt almost impossible. Evelyn explained quietly that the man once known by that code name had been the finest systems specialist in a classified initiative called Asterion, a program built to test experimental flight control architecture years ahead of anything commercial. 12 years earlier, he had been on board an advanced prototype called the Aquila 12 when it vanished from radar during a routine evaluation flight. Investigators found burned wreckage in a dry lake bed in Nevada, but no remains could ever be positively identified, and the government eventually declared the entire test team deceased. Rowan still refused to confirm anything about his past, but he warned Sloan that the device hidden in her jet was not something an amateur saboteur could build in a garage. It could feed false position data, trigger phantom engine alarms, and slowly convince a flight crew that every instrument on the panel had turned against them. The goal was rarely to crash the aircraft outright, but to force a pilot into making one catastrophic decision under the belief that the decision was necessary. Sloan wanted the device transported straight to Blackwood's own laboratories for analysis. Rowan objected immediately, arguing that any evidence carried into corporate headquarters could disappear before anyone outside the company ever examines it properly. Before they could settle the argument, Chief Test Pilot Naomi Vance called with news that turned the argument moot within seconds, reporting that engineers had just found an identical timing signature buried inside the new Vesper X prototype scheduled for its investor unveiling. Rowan realized the saboteur had not simply resurfaced by coincidence.
Someone out there already knew Orion was alive, and that someone wanted him back in the cockpit. Sloan spent the better part of an hour convincing Rowan to accompany her to Blackwood's testing center, promising that his identity would remain protected and that a discreet security detail would watch over Maisie without the girl ever noticing. Rowan agreed only after setting 3 conditions that Sloan accepted without hesitation. No one would touch the recovered device without his presence. Every byte of data would be copied onto an independent server outside company control, and if the trail ever pointed towards someone inside Blackwood itself, he would be free to report it directly to federal investigators. At an archive building Sloan rarely visited, Evelyn unsealed a storage room that had remained locked for 12 years, its shelves lined with folders marked Aquila 12 and a small collection of photographs from the Asterion team. Sloan studied one image longer than the rest, a younger version of Rowan standing beside the prototype, his printed name blacked out beneath a strip of tape that had long since yellowed. Whatever doubt remained in her mind disappeared the instant she matched his eyes in the photograph to the man standing quietly beside her. Rowan finally offered a fragment of the truth he had guarded for over a decade. The Aquila 12 had not fallen from the sky the way official reports claimed, because he had shut down the failing central computer himself and guided the aircraft onto a dry lake bed using nothing but manual backup controls. After the crew evacuated safely, a fire consumed most of the wreckage before anyone could preserve the evidence buried inside the flight recorder. A counterintelligence unit quietly extracted him afterward, convinced that the sabotage had originated from someone inside Blackwood Aeronautics itself, and his death was announced to keep that unnamed insider from ever feeling threatened again. Evelyn admitted she had never known he survived, insisting she was only handed a signed death declaration and instructed never to ask further questions in the name of national security. Sloan could barely contain her anger at learning her own mother had helped bury a near catastrophe that involved the company bearing their name. Evelyn answered that revealing the truth back then would have destroyed Blackwood overnight and caused thousands of employees their livelihoods, a justification that sounded hollow even to her own ears as she said it aloud. Rowan told her plainly that the same reasoning had allowed a saboteur to operate freely for 12 uninterrupted years. When they finally opened the last surviving data fragment from the Aquila 12, the electronic signature buried inside matched the bridging device found aboard Sloan's jet almost perfectly, confirming that whoever built the original weapon had never truly stopped building it. Sloane sat alone with the folders for a long while after Rowan and her mother left the archive room, turning the pages slowly as though the paper itself might explain how an entire chapter of her family's history had been erased so cleanly. She had grown up believing Blackwood Aeronautics was built on careful engineering and her father's stubborn integrity, not on a signature her own mother had pressed onto a document meant to bury a man alive. The photographs troubled her most. Ordinary snapshots of a test crew laughing beside a fueling truck, none of them aware that within days their names would be scrubbed from every internal record the company kept. She thought about the version of herself who had spent years defending Blackwood's history in press interviews, repeating the same clean narrative about innovation and sacrifice without ever questioning where the gaps in that story came from. It unsettled her to realize how easily a company could reshape its own past simply by deciding which papers were worth keeping and which were better left to rot in a sealed room. For the first time since taking over as chief executive, Sloane wondered how many other rooms like this one still existed somewhere inside the building she had inherited. Rowan, for his part, found himself standing longer than he intended in front of the photograph of his younger self, the blacked-out name beneath it, a small, tidy erasure of everything he used to be. He remembered the weight of that old flight suit, the particular hum of the Aquila 12's cabin before a test run, and the strange hollow pride of being trusted with machinery no one else was allowed to touch. None of that pride had prepared him for the years afterward, the shifting apartments, the different last names, the quiet ache of watching his own obituary printed in a newspaper he was not permitted to correct. He had built an entirely new life out of that erasure, one measured in oil changes and torque specifications rather than classified briefings, and for years it had been enough simply to exist without anyone asking questions. Standing in that archive room, he understood that the version of himself who had accepted disappearance as a fair price for safety was being asked for the first time in over a decade to reconsider what he actually owed the truth. Rowan spent the following morning inspecting the Vesper X with Naomi, and within an hour he located a diagnostic bridge buried deep in the electronics bay that appeared nowhere in the aircraft's official design documentation. Several members of Blackwood's engineering staff made little effort to hide his skepticism, treating him as a small-town mechanic hoping to impress the chief executive rather than a man who understood the aircraft better than they did. One senior engineer remarked openly that his knowledge belonged to a decade already left behind, a remark Rowan absorbed without argument. Instead of debating credentials, Rowan asked the team to pull the raw system logs rather than the filtered summaries their software normally produced. The unedited records revealed that Vesper X had been quietly receiving unidentified data packets during several recent test flights, always arriving at the exact moment a pilot's attention was most divided, during takeoff, during a heading change, or during a sudden descent. Silas Bancroft arrived partway through the review, greeting Rowan with practiced warmth while instructing the crew to keep the schedule moving forward without delay. He referred to Rowan only as the temporary contractor, a small phrase delivered with polite warmth that Sloane recognized instantly as quiet condescension dressed up as courtesy.
A limited test flight went forward with Naomi at the controls, Rowan monitoring the systems, and Sloane riding along because she refused to accept second-hand reports about her own aircraft. At cruising altitude, the navigation display suddenly claimed the plane had drifted off course, even though ground radar confirmed their position was correct. Moments later, the autopilot began lowering the nose to correct an altitude that had never actually been wrong. Naomi disengaged the automated system, but the warnings kept contradicting one another faster than the ground crew could interpret them, and controllers on the radio urged her to simply reboot everything at once. Rowan recognized the pattern immediately as the same trap that had doomed the Aquila 12, an attempt to convince the crew that every instrument had failed so they would attempt one dangerous, unnecessary maneuver. He told Naomi to hold her course and isolate only the corrupted data channel instead of shutting the entire system down, and the aircraft leveled out within seconds.
In those tense moments, Sloane watched him work the cabin with the calm precision of someone who had never truly left the cockpit behind, whatever name he now carried on his identification card. When they landed and reviewed the intercepted transmission, a short automated message appeared buried inside the corrupted packet, confirming that someone out there did not merely suspect Rowan had survived, they still possessed his original authorization key from 12 years earlier, and they had just used it to invite him back. Within a day, footage of Rowan seated inside the Vesper X cockpit leaked to several outlets, accompanied by a headline calling him a mysterious engineer tied to a long-forgotten aviation failure. Silas used the sudden controversy to call an emergency session of the board, accusing Sloane of allowing an unverified individual into a prototype worth hundreds of millions of dollars and endangering the company's most important asset. Directors already nervous about the mounting cost of Vesper X sided quickly with Silas, and Sloane's authority over the flight test program was suspended before the meeting even adjourned. Silas proposed transferring oversight to a special committee under his direct leadership, insisting the public unveiling had to proceed on schedule to reassure nervous investors watching the stock closely. Rowan understood immediately that the saboteur had achieved a critical objective, stripping Sloane of control over her own aircraft without ever touching a single wire. He decided it was time to leave, unwilling to let Maisie's life become collateral damage in a corporate war that had nothing to do with her. Sloane did not try to physically stop him, but she asked quietly whether the man once called Orion had always walked away whenever someone needed him most. The question struck a nerve, and Rowan answered that Orion had already lost his entire team, his name, and years of an ordinary life, and that he owed Blackwood nothing further. Evelyn intercepted him before he reached the exit and confessed she had personally signed a statement blaming pilot error for the Aquila 12 disaster, knowing in her heart that Orion had never made a mistake resembling what the report described. She also revealed something Rowan had never known, that Sloane's late father had quietly investigated a batch of components supplied by a subsidiary connected to Bancroft Capital, an inquiry cut short when illness took his life before he could finish it. Rowan pulled up the serial number stamped on the bridging device recovered from Vesper X and traced its registration through a dissolved supplier, following the paper trail until it settled unmistakably on Bancroft Capital's ownership records. He walked back into the boardroom and told Sloane plainly that he was not returning for Blackwood's sake, but because other aircraft out there might still be carrying the same hidden weapon. It was the first true reversal of the story. The mechanic the board had dismissed as unqualified, turning out to be the only person alive who understood exactly what kind of danger sat inside their flagship program. Sloane, Rowan, and Naomi quietly formed a small investigative circle outside official company channels, copying every relevant flight record onto an independent server hidden away at Greyhaven before anyone could tamper with it. Access logs revealed that the hidden device aboard Vesper X had been activated using Evelyn's personal credentials, and Sloane began to wonder whether her own mother was protecting someone from 12 years ago without realizing it. Evelyn denied any involvement, but could not explain how her private authorization code had been used, and for a tense afternoon, the relationship between mother and daughter grew as strained as it had ever been. Rowan refused to jump to conclusions, noting that Evelyn's credentials had been logged at a moment when she was giving a live speech in front of hundreds of witnesses, proof that someone had cloned her old access key rather than stolen it in person. That kind of cloning was only possible with material pulled directly from the Asterion archive or salvaged from the wreckage of the Aquila 12 itself. Naomi discovered that Silas privately owned a small aircraft storage facility less than an hour from the testing center, a property once registered as overflow storage for components tied to canceled programs.
Rowan and Sloane visited the hangar under the pretense of a routine asset inspection, and although Silas had already cleared most of the space, Rowan noticed bolt marks on the concrete floor that matched the mounting brackets once used for the Aquila 12's backup flight computer. Inside a forgotten storage bin, they found a partially burned memory module, and Rowan recognized the housing instantly as belonging to the prototype's emergency data recorder. Sloane wanted to hand evidence straight to investigators, but Rowan cautioned that the module alone could not yet prove Silas had personally ordered the sabotage, and moving too fast might give him time to destroy whatever remained. When they finally recovered a short fragment of audio from the damaged recorder, a voice from 12 years ago confirmed that the diagnostic bridge had been installed under direct instructions from what the recording called the Bancroft office. Right behind that fragment played a younger version of Rowan's own voice, calmly ordering his crew to prepare for an emergency landing before the recording cut to static. Silas appeared at the hangar without warning, unbothered by their discovery, and calmly noted that entering private property to remove sealed evidence would make Rowan an ideal suspect if the matter ever reached a courtroom.
Corporate security arrived soon after, yet Silas never requested an arrest, content instead to let Rowan walk free so he could keep leading him toward whatever proof still remained hidden somewhere out of reach. Driving away from the hangar that night, Naomi pulled up alongside the burned memory module spread across the back seat and asked Rowan how he had managed to stay so calm while a man who clearly wanted him blamed for a felony stood only a few feet away. Rowan admitted that calm was mostly a habit built over many years of pretending nothing frightened him, a discipline he had first learned inside the Aquila 12's cockpit and never quite managed to set down afterward. He told her that panic was the one tool Silas actually needed to win, because a frightened engineer made mistakes that a patient one never would. Sloane spent the drive studying the ownership documents on her phone, tracing Bancroft Capital's fingerprints through 3 different shell entities before the trail finally went cold at a registered agent's office in a state she had never once visited for company business. She noticed how carefully the paperwork had been layered, each entity just distant enough from the last to survive a routine audit, and it struck her that building a disguise this elaborate required years of patient preparation rather than a single desperate scheme. Whoever assembled it had been planning long before Vesper X ever existed, waiting only for a project large enough to justify the risk. Back at Greyhaven, Rowan spent most of the night carefully drying out the salvaged memory module using equipment better suited to a data recovery lab than a regional airfield's back office, refusing to let anyone else touch it until he was certain the fragile circuitry would survive. Naomi stayed with him long after Sloane had gone to check on her mother, passing him tools without needing to be asked, and somewhere around midnight she finally said what she had been thinking since the test flight, that whoever trained him all those years ago trained him well enough to still notice things trained engineers twice his age missed entirely. Rowan only nodded and kept working, unwilling to talk about a man he had spent 12 years trying not to think about at all. Rowan finally laid out everything that happened in the hours following the Aquila 12's forced landing. Evidence recovered afterward strongly suggested the sabotage originated from inside Blackwood itself, but before he could bring it forward, a fire consumed the electronics bay and destroyed nearly everything that might have proven it. A counterintelligence team, suspicious that even the rescue crew had been compromised, quietly relocated him under a new identity soon after. The investigation dragged on for years while facing constant, unexplained obstruction from within the system meant to support it. Evidence disappearing from secured servers, witnesses reassigned to postings overseas before they could be fully interviewed, and budget reviews that always seemed to shrink the moment the inquiry edged closer to a name with real influence attached to it.
Rowan spent those years testifying quietly to investigators who kept changing every 18 months, repeating the same account to unfamiliar faces until even he began to wonder whether anyone above a certain rank actually wanted the truth found at all. Once the trail went cold, Rowan chose to stop chasing ghosts and live quietly as Rowan Hale. And when his wife passed away from illness not long after, he raised Maisie alone rather than risk pulling her into a world defined by secrecy and danger. He had turned down every offer to return to experimental aviation because he refused to let his daughter grow up beside a father forever hunting his own past, choosing instead the unglamorous rhythm of torque wrenches and maintenance logs, a life small enough that no one ever thought to look for Orion inside it. Sloane finally understood that Rowan had not disappeared out of cowardice. He had surrendered his reputation entirely to give his daughter something resembling an ordinary childhood. The next recovered fragment confirmed that Sloane's father had never been involved in the sabotage at all, and had instead discovered that Bancroft Capital was quietly selling diagnostic systems built with hidden backdoor access to multiple aviation companies at once. Silas originally sabotaged the Aquila 12 to derail its unveiling and force Blackwood into financial dependence on Bancroft's investment fund. The accident spiraled far beyond his original plan, but rather than stop, he used his influence to bury the entire investigation before it ever reached the public. 12 years later, he attempted the same strategy against Vesper X, having already shorted Blackwood stock and arranged a rescue financing deal that would let Bancroft Capital seize the company's patents the moment it collapsed. He never intended to crash an aircraft in front of cameras, only to manufacture a terrifying chain of alarms convincing enough to force an emergency landing and freeze the entire test program indefinitely. Rowan's unexpected return had complicated that plan considerably, and Silas responded by using the cloned Orion credentials both to taunt him personally and to frame him as the most convenient suspect available. The board announced that the Vesper X unveiling would proceed the following morning despite Sloane's objections, with Silas personally overseeing the flight systems from the company's operations center. Rowan recognized this as the only real opportunity to catch him in the act of activating the very device he believed no one else understood. Alone in his office that evening, Silas allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, certain that a mechanic from a regional airfield posed no real threat to a plan he had spent over a decade refining across 3 separate companies. He had watched Blackwood claw its way back from the brink once before, and had learned exactly which levers to pull to bring it to the edge again, patiently buying influence, funding friendly board members, and waiting for a moment when the company's ambition would outpace its caution.
Vesper X represented the largest bet Blackwood had ever made, and to Silas, it made it the perfect instrument for finally finishing what the Aquila 12 had only begun. He did not think of himself as a saboteur so much as a corrector of overconfident institutions, a man forced to use unconventional tools because slower, legitimate methods had never once worked in his favor. The deaths he believed he had caused 12 years earlier still visited him occasionally in the quiet hours, though he had long since trained himself to file the memory away as an unfortunate miscalculation rather than a crime deserving guilt. What unsettled him now was not conscience, but uncertainty, a small, persistent doubt about how a man he believed had been eliminated from every official record could still walk into a hangar and recognize his own handiwork within minutes. Silas told himself that even if Orion had somehow survived, the world had already been convinced of his death for over a decade, and reputations built on that kind of public certainty rarely survived a single mechanic's uncorroborated claims. He underestimated, as he always had, the particular danger of a man with nothing left to protect except the truth and a daughter waiting for him to come home. And he never considered that Rowan might choose to walk directly back into the fire rather than disappear a second time.
Rowan built his plan around turning the unveiling flight into a technical trap of his own design. He deliberately left the hidden bridge installed inside Vesper X, reasoning that removing it would immediately alert Silas that his scheme had been discovered. Instead, he wired a passive recording channel that would capture every remote command sent through the device without triggering any warning on the sender's end. Naomi would fly the aircraft, Rowan would monitor the systems from the engineering seat, and Sloane would ride along as the company's own representative, determined to prove her confidence in the product with her presence rather than a press statement. Before boarding, Rowan called Maisie one final time, and she asked when he would be home so they could finish rebuilding an old model airplane together, exactly as they had planned for weeks. Rowan told her he had one last piece of work to finish before coming home. Maisie did not ask her father to be a hero. She simply told him to make sure he came back. A request so plain it settled something inside him that years of investigation never had. The call reminded Rowan that his goal was never to resurrect a legend, only to close a chapter of his life so he could keep living the one he had built afterward as himself. Sloane overheard part of the conversation and promised that whatever happened next, she would never let Blackwood use him as a tool again. A quiet trust had grown between them, patient and unhurried, built on something steadier than the crisis surrounding them. Sloane no longer saw a legend hidden behind a mechanic's coveralls. She saw a man who simply wanted to return home to her daughter, and that mattered to her far more than any codename ever could. She told him, almost hesitantly, that she had spent her entire adult life being introduced as the heir to something enormous, a company, a fortune, an expectation she had never been allowed to question, and that watching him choose an ordinary life over a legendary one had quietly rearranged how she thought about her own choices. Rowan admitted that ordinary had not always felt like a choice so much as a sentence he learned to accept, but somewhere over the years spent watching Maisie grow, the sentence had become something closer to a gift. Neither of them tried to name what was forming between them, content instead to let it exist unhurried in the narrow space between a crisis and whatever came after it. Evelyn used her authority as a founding shareholder to have the entire unveiling flight's data streamed live into the boardroom, and Silas, believing this would only strengthen the presentation, raised no objection. Rowan quietly built a false interface designed to convince the operations center that the bridging device remained under their complete control, while every genuine command sent through it would be captured and isolated before reaching the aircraft. Just before the cabin door closed, Silas approached Rowan and shook his hand, leaning in to murmur a warning meant only for the two of them. Rowan answered calmly that Silas was right about one thing, because Orion would not be flying that morning at all, only Rowan Hale, a man with nothing left to hide and nothing left to prove. Vesper X lifted off under the watchful eyes of the board, a room full of investors and officials from Federal Aviation Oversight, every screen tuned to the historic unveiling. The early portion of the flight went exactly as planned, and Silas grew confident that Rowan had failed to detect the full scope of what he had built into the system. As the aircraft prepared for its automated demonstration sequence, the operations center transmitted a command using the cloned Orion authorization key, instantly triggering false readings for speed, altitude, and engine temperature all at once. Naomi kept her composure exactly as Rowan had instructed, ignoring the cascade of contradictory alarms, but instead verifying the aircraft's condition through independent mechanical instruments unaffected by the corrupted software. Silas escalated with a stronger command, ordering the autopilot to drop the nose and divert toward a backup airfield, hoping to create the appearance of Vesper X spiraling out of control in front of hundreds of witnesses. Rowan activated the isolation channel he had built the night before, and the aircraft ignored the command entirely, while quietly logging the originating address, the authorization key, and the exact timestamp of the attempted intrusion. Sloan ordered the captured data displayed directly on the boardroom screens, and in front of the entire assembled board, the sabotage commands traced back unmistakably to Silas Bancroft's personal workstation.
A murmur spread through the room as directors who'd sided with him only days earlier began quietly shifting their chairs away from his end of the table, none of them willing to be photographed anywhere near a man whose name had just appeared beside a felony in progress. Silas insisted his system had been compromised by an outside party, but Rowan immediately followed with the recovered audio fragment from the Aquila 12 and the ownership records tying the original bridging device to Bancroft Capital. One of the older board members, a woman who had sat on Blackwood's board since its earliest years, asked Silas directly whether he intended to explain the 12-year gap between the two identical sabotage patterns or simply continue denying evidence the entire room had already watched with its own eyes. Silas tried to redirect the conversation toward Rowan's own unverified identity, suggesting that a man hiding behind a false name for over a decade made a poor witness against anyone. Rowan answered that he had spent 12 years hiding from the very device Silas had just tried to use against an aircraft full of people, and he saw no reason to keep hiding from it any longer. Evelyn stood before the room and publicly admitted she had once helped conceal the earlier disaster, accepting full responsibility for her role without hesitation, and her confession stripped away the last shield Silas had left to hide behind. In one final act of desperation, Silas transmitted a false warning claiming the landing gear had failed to deploy, but Rowan confirmed through mechanical sensors that the gear remained fully operational. Noemi completed a careful visual pass before bringing Vesper X down safely on the runway. There was no crash, no violence, no dramatic confrontation on the tarmac, only a man undone by the very data he believed belonged to him alone. Federal agents were waiting when Vesper X rolled to a stop, and Silas was taken into custody on charges tied to aviation sabotage, market manipulation, and the destruction of evidence spanning more than a decade. Sloan stepped off the aircraft in front of the assembled cameras, turned back toward Rowan, and refused to introduce him using the name that had haunted him for 12 years. Instead, she simply called him Rowan Hale, the man who had just saved the future of Blackwood Aeronautics, with nothing but steady hands and an unwillingness to look away. The wider investigation eventually proved that Silas had directed several shell companies to plant identical bridging devices across other aviation programs entirely unrelated to Blackwood, and every unit was recovered before it could cause further harm. The board reinstated Sloan as chief executive and immediately terminated every financial arrangement tied to Bancroft Capital, closing the door to 12 years of quiet manipulation in a single afternoon. Vesper X underwent a full independent review before its certification process resumed, this time under oversight no single company could quietly control. Evelyn held a public briefing acknowledging that Blackwood had once blamed the Aquila 12 crew for a disaster the family had long known was never their fault, formally clearing the names of every engineer who had vanished from the official record that day. She met Rowan privately at Greyhaven soon afterward and apologized for placing the survival of the company above the dignity of the people who had built it. Rowan did not forgive her instantly, but he acknowledged that she had ultimately chosen honesty even knowing it would cost her family's carefully guarded reputation. Sloan offered Rowan the position of chief technical officer at Blackwood Aeronautics, and he declined, unwilling to trade his daughter's ordinary life for another existence built around boardrooms, security details, and aircraft carrying secrets of their own. Instead, he proposed something different, an independent aviation safety division named the Orion Protocol, dedicated to finding the kinds of hidden vulnerabilities that could trick a pilot into trusting the wrong instrument at the wrong moment. The division would be based permanently at Greyhaven, so Rowan could keep raising Maisie without uprooting either of their lives. Blackwood would fund the work but hold no authority to alter or bury a single report it produced, and Sloan accepted every condition without argument. In the weeks that followed, Noemi transferred out of Blackwood's primary test program to help Rowan build the new division from nothing, arguing that after everything they had survived together, she was not about to let him assemble a safety team without a pilot who actually trusted his instincts. Evelyn quietly funded a scholarship in the names of the original Asterian crew, ensuring that the engineers erased from Blackwood's official history would finally be remembered somewhere permanent, even if the world never learned the full story behind their disappearance. Sloane visited Greyhaven often enough that the ground crew stopped commenting on it, arriving sometimes with contracts to review and sometimes with nothing more than an excuse to watch Rowan work. Maisie grew used to seeing Sloane's car parked beside the hangar in the evenings, and though she never asked her father directly what the two of them were becoming, she noticed the particular ease that had settled into their conversations, the kind that only grows between two people who have already survived the worst version of getting to know each other. Rowan found himself thinking less often about the man he used to be and more about ordinary things, whether Maisie's model airplane needed a second coat of paint, whether Sloane preferred her coffee before or after it got cold, whether Greyhaven's runway lights needed replacing before winter. The Orion protocol issued its first public safety bulletin within 2 months, quietly forcing 3 unrelated manufacturers to recall diagnostic hardware built on the same vulnerable architecture Silas had once exploited. None of the reports carried Rowan's real name, only the division's, exactly the way he wanted, a legacy built on prevention rather than recognition. Evelyn visited Greyhaven one final time before stepping back from the board entirely, walking the length of the small hangar with a slower gait than the one that had once commanded entire rooms.
She told Rowan that watching him build something quiet and lasting after the wreckage of Asterion had taught her more about leadership than 3 decades at Blackwood ever had. He walked her back to her car without answering, but he shook her hand before she left. A small gesture that closed a distance 12 years of silence had never quite managed to bridge on its own. In the final scene, Maisie arrived at the hangar after school and noticed a small 7-point constellation painted near the wing of an old test aircraft. Asking her father why everyone once called him by the name of a star pattern, Rowan told her it used to belong to a man who believed he had to carry the entire sky by himself. Maisie asked whether that man was gone now. Rowan looked toward Sloane, who stood just outside the hangar doors holding 2 cups of coffee and watching them both with a quiet, unhurried patience. He smiled and told his daughter that the man had simply learned he no longer had to carry it alone. Sloane handed Rowan his coffee and asked if she could stay and watch the two of them finish rebuilding the model airplane together. Rowan answered by pulling the hangar door open wider, an invitation that needed no further words. The constellation on the old test aircraft's fuselage caught the afternoon light one last time, but Rowan no longer flinched whenever he heard the name painted beneath it. Orion had finally been cleared. Rowan Hale had finally been allowed to live. If you love aviation secrets and a twist that catches your breath, hit subscribe and follow along as Orion finds his way home for good.